you very much for coming to this panel discussion tonight, Blurring Boundaries, Confronting Ethnography and Contemporary Art in the Museum. This discussion has been organised by the 11 students of the Curating the Museum Masters here at the Courtauld Institute of Art. Each year, the students on this course are asked to organise 2 debates, so this is our first one, and the second one will come up in early June, so keep your eyes open for it. Tonight we'll hear a discussion on what seems to us a very timely topic. Ethnographic museums and ethnographic objects have increasingly hit the headlines over the past month, mainly due to an increasing concern for decolonising the museum space, for restituting works, and for changing the moods of display. Why getting our heads around the ethnographic material in question in museums and galleries? We, the Curating, noticed that several displays exhibited ethnographic art alongside contemporary art. Examples of this are Oceania, the exhibition held at the Royal Academy last semester, created by Professor Thomas, who we will have the pleasure to hear tonight, and the recently reopened Asian Gallery at the British Museum, curated by Dr. Venetia Porter, who we also are delighted to have here tonight in the crowd. These displays aim to increase viewers' understanding of and insight into different culture, essentially maybe non-Western culture and artistic practice. Knowing that fine art and ethnographic art have been for a very long time defined as 2 different and separate categories, we shall tonight look at the implications of showing these objects alongside each other. How does it influence the way we perceive them? How does their display enrich each other? Equally, how do artists feel about being actively involved in these forms of museum displays? To shed light on these questions, we have invited tonight Professor Thomas, Director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, and Curator of the Oceania exhibition that was held at the Royal Academy I just talked about. His work as an anthropologist and historian focuses on material culture, exploration, empire, and art in Oceania. Sokari Douglas Camp, London-based artist, she takes inspiration from both her Nigerian heritage and life in the UK, and has represented both countries in national exhibitions. She was awarded a CBE in recognition of her services to art. Professor Haidy Geismar, Professor of Anthropology at UCL, where she teaches within the Material Culture Department. She also is co-director of the UCL Centre for Digital Anthropology. Her work looks at material and digital culture together, explores the impact of technologies on cultural representation, and considers contemporary museum practices. Today's conversation will be chaired by our very own Professor Deborah Swallow, Märit Rausing, Director of the Courtauld Institute of Art. She began a career as an assistant curator at the Museum of Anthropology and Archaeology in Cambridge. Afterwards, she became the Asian Department Keeper and Director of Collections at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Her work as a social anthropologist and curator reflects a deep interest in the arts and culture of the Indian subcontinent. Now, please join me in welcoming our fantastic speakers.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come to the Courtauld and engage with students and colleagues and curators at this institution. I found the question about ethnography collections challenging for a rather particular reason. I felt, in a sense, it was the not necessarily the right place to start from. Is what you were looking at an ethnography collection, or is it a history collection, or is it just an art collection? I think many museum collections are inherently cross-disciplinary. They are made up of things that have diverse origins and trajectories that have been burdened, in a sense, not only with definitions and descriptions by their creators, but also by many successive owners, curators, collectors, scholars. Since I started work in this museum, and this is not just a sort of hypothetical issue, I've been very concerned to argue that we curate cross-disciplinary collections that are as salient to histories of empire and knowledge, salient to art histories, as also to the range of questions that we might call anthropological and ethnographic. Material from this collection has been contextualized in many different ways, or decontextualized in many different ways over a long period. The International Surrealist Exhibition in 1936 included every major artist of the period you've heard of, but also about a dozen ethnographic objects which all came from the collection in Cambridge, and in fact, intriguingly, had been very recently collected by a prominent Cambridge anthropologist, Gregory Bateson. Of course, there's a whole debate about that set of inspirations and inclusions and misrepresentations that I'm not going to talk about here. And this kind of thing carries on. We share our collections in a variety of ways. For example, through a loan to a Museum of World Cultures in Barcelona, a relatively new museum that adopts a sort of Met in Metropolitan Museum kind of art aesthetic. When I was reflecting on the questions raised by this discussion tonight, I thought back to an essay of Hal Foster's, published not quite 25 years ago, The Artist as Ethnographer, posing the question of what interventions that Hal Foster took to have become relatively popular, a sort of new model of engagement, how they were to be adjudicated. He cited things like a Baumgarten installation in the Guggenheim in New York that was drawing attention to histories of colonization in the Americas, and possibly also one of the most famous such early interventions, Fred Wilson's insertion of slave manacles and objects like that in various museum displays. But Hal Foster's question was, are these radical subversive projects, or are these artists simply being co-opted by these institutions? And the essay intrigued me because he wraps it up in this completely inconclusive way and says, well, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. And it seemed, I mean, for someone who's got such a reputation as a sort of brilliant and powerful critic, a rather kind of lame way to wrap up an essay, you know, this charged question, and then your answer sometimes, or sometimes not. But I think actually that had the strength of being an honest answer, because surely, I don't know if this is just my experience, but artists' projects, contemporary artists' projects, or the project of drawing artists into museums of a variety of kinds, whether they're ethnographic or scientific or museums of antiquities, is sometimes successful and sometimes not. And we've tried to do this in the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and I think mostly thought about it fairly deeply and tried to bring in artists who had, in a sense, sort of questions of the collection, questions of the institution, who were not people, in a sense, we were just curating, but who were co-interpreters of the issues that we thought confronted us as curators. And so one of them's Lisa Ray Hana, who participated in an exhibition called Pacific Stars that took place in Cambridge about 13 years ago, curated just before I arrived at the museum. She was interested in this sculpture, which itself has a very interesting kind of history connected with the history of the museum. It's broadly from the area she comes from, part of her tribal background and history, but she basically performed a sort of reverse repatriation by surrounding the figure with images, video and sound from home. And there's quite a lot I could say about this. There's also connections with her family history and so on, which I won't go into because it will take too long. Another instance was work by Brooke Andrew, who's now become an extremely eminent Indigenous Australian artist. As it happens, he's the director of the next Biennale of Sydney. But from the start, really, from his early work when he was a student in his 20s, he was very interested in sort of mining the anthropological archive, mining photographic archives and manipulating images he got out of those in contemporary work. And when he first visited Cambridge, not long after I arrived there, he was extremely interested in a sort of early album that was made up of these tiny images, many of them related to Aboriginal life. And the one that is the second from the right on the bottom, which depicts an Aboriginal mortuary monument, he scaled up into this huge print, as you see, 3 metres in width, which incidentally Martin and I curated in an exhibition called Discoveries at Two Temple Place a few years ago. That just gives you a sense of the scale. And he was interested in this because I think the stereotypes about Aboriginal culture were that they were just foragers and made no impact on the landscape or the environment. He saw this early colonial image as representing a sort of indigenous landscape architecture, an environmental image that he wanted to turn into sort of billboard kind of scale. And so obviously there are kind of affinities between both Lisa Rehana's questions and Brooke's questions of what we do with these kinds of collections in the present that made these works particularly valuable to us. And we were fortunate, incidentally, that the Art Fund enabled us to buy this piece. And just very briefly with respect to Oceania, I think the ambition was not to, I mean, obviously to do a range of things in that project, but not just to present the art and history of the region from the vantage point of a couple of expert curators who I worked with a colleague from New Zealand, Peter Brunt, on that project. It wasn't just our expert view, we were trying to create a realm of discussion and engagement, a realm in which people could respond and present their own sorts of narratives, and part of that was featuring contemporary artists who, again, were sort of co-interpreters of the kinds of histories and challenges that we wanted to work through.
Hi, can you hear me? Yes. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. My career was started up by some chap seeing my work at the Africa Centre in London, where I was the first resident artist at the age of 23 or something, very young. And he saw my work and realised that I was interested in masquerades, and masquerades are figures like this. And I was always rather disturbed that at the British Museum they showed masks on sticks and seemed out of context to a person who's familiar with masks being on people's heads or on top of people's heads, because my people, the Kalabari in Nigeria, wear masks on our top of our heads because we have a conversation with God with the mask that's on top of our head. And artists and carvers in the Delta have sort of morphed the hippo masquerade, for instance. They morphed the hippo masquerade, hippo structure with the human face, so that it became quite abstract and rather terrifying. And but the thing is that masquerading is contemporary and tied in with the culture in the Delta, and the British Museum kind of took it up, or it was collected by the British without anybody really knowing what it was about. And I always think that they could ask. But they didn't. Anyway, so this is called gelede from top to toe, and gelede basically means to pacify a woman's private parts, which I think gave me the right to make this piece of work, because being Nigerian, I have some respect for masquerades, because they're spirits and you're meant to be scared of them, and so I had to find a way into owning this work, and it's a little bit over life size, and young men would dress like this in Lagos, and I don't think the breasts were quite like that, but artistic license, I wanted them to really project. And the gelede masquerade is dressed up like that, and it's meant to mock the women in the markets that are very kind of successful, and the young men that would dress like this would try to mock these women that were very powerful. And also when they dressed like this, because they were hidden, they could not exactly say poetry, but have some kind of conversation with the people that would watch them pretending to be women. Anyway, I better move on. So this is a close-up of the work that I do. I normally work in steel, and I love making my own things. The other thing about gelede masquerades, it was that it made me notice that gelede also has amazing carvings that are made from the Yoruba people, and I imagined as an artist that these were like thoughts, bubbles, thought bubbles, and so this particular gelede is called bus stop gelede, mad cow bus stop gelede, just because at the time we had mad cow disease, and these people are waiting at the bus stop, and I always fantasize when I look at people in London, because the young man standing at the bus stop could be a gelede player from Nigeria, and then there's a sort of older couple that aren't talking to each other, and a young girl who's looking at herself in the glass. But my heritage in the Niger Delta was masquerades like this, being in our environment. And when they walk around, these characters make sounds. So some of my work in my early career was kinetic, so that I had machines that were dancing away, because masquerade, the art of masquerading had a lot to do with dance, movement and costume. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. Anyway, this is Alaba, and it's a Kalabari masquerade, and he has a companion that plays with him, and I don't know, it's just a very beautiful masquerade, and it opens the sequence of masquerades that play for the Kalabari people, and there's a 17-year cycle when all the masquerades come out and play, and then it's just singular masquerades that play until 17 years, and they all come out to play. So I was excited to learn about these things as in my 20s. So here is a masquerade that is in Peking. It's swordfish masquerade, but people think that it's Florence Nightingale. Masquerades in the Delta are quite extraordinary because they dress themselves up to be 7 months pregnant, and they have tails or erections, and this is Big Boat Masquerade with its whole household or something. Very strange titles I chose for my work. But I wanted to show you another boat themed piece that is an antiquity, but it's from the Niger Delta, and these things are not meant to be seen by women. And the Museum of Mankind had a display of these things, and I freaked out rather. It was at the time when you had to write home, and then I had to wait for an air-mailed letter to tell me that it was all right to go and see these things because they'd lost their power by coming across the water. So this collection was in the British Museum, and I loved looking at it in detail because I'd never had that license before. And basically it's showing an ancestor that played a boat masquerade, and then there are a few characters on the top that would have been people that this chap conquered. And it's a shrine that's meant to tell you a little bit about the history of the person that has this particular shrine, and it's like a stele. So this is what a Dwayne Fubra is. I decided to use this theme in some of the pieces that I made, and at the time there was 9/11, and this is called Bin Laden Theatre or something, but Bin Laden was a icon of that time. And this is called Sharia Fubra. Sharia law was kind of tightened in northern Nigeria, and they got some new gadget in to cut off people's arms, and as an artist I just thought that was really threatening, so I made this northern dressed woman with no arms but hands, and that must be it.
I haven't got a PowerPoint. Can you hear me if I sit down? Is that okay? I should come in the middle. Okay. I don't feel like So thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and an honour to follow Nick and Sokari and add my kind of contribution to the mix of this discussion about the relationship between ethnographic collections and contemporary art. And apologies for not having a PowerPoint because it's good to see things when you're talking about museums and art. But I want to make 3 points that all come out of my own career working as a museum curator and researcher in many different places. Now, as was mentioned, I'm teaching in an anthropology department, and I run a program called Digital Anthropology, which is the kind of next iteration of a research trajectory that started as material culture and has kind of opened up from just the material to include the visual, the design and the digital, ever expanding. And I'm also the curator of the UCL ethnography collections, which are quite interesting collections to work with and which we have a lot of freedom to experiment. So I have 3 points which really come out of this research trajectory. And the first one, I think, started right at the beginning of my research career when I went to Vanuatu to do my doctoral research in 2000. And I worked, my PhD research, I worked for over a year embedded in the Vanuatu National Museum and Cultural Centre, working on a lot of different projects with the museum, bringing together practitioners whose work really sat in an interesting place in the boundary between the making of what one might call ethnographic collections, or what one might call contemporary handicrafts, or what one might call contemporary arts. And that's really coloured the perspective that I've had on some of the debates about the relationship between contemporary art and the ethnographic, because the artists that I were working with and the place that I was working in was very marginal or peripheral to the contemporary art world. So in Vanuatu, there's no art school, there's no art galleries. There aren't really contemporary art dealers. There are very few opportunities for artists to engage internationally with other artists, except very sporadically if they can get money to attend arts festivals. And they don't have, there's no art shop, so they have, the materials that they use are either extremely generic or they have to make them themselves. And they're very aware of the fact that they sit in this marginal sort of place in which they are looking outwards towards contemporary art, imagining themselves as contemporary artists, but not really producing work that's often recognized in that world as bona fide contemporary art. And talking to them about how they defined their own work, what they thought they were doing, raised a lot of really interesting questions for me about the kind of implicit aesthetic norms that structure the global contemporary art world, which often are not excavated, are not talked about, but are very much assumed and bind together practitioners all around the world, actually who share what is actually quite a narrow set of aesthetic conventions in some ways. So I think that's my first point, which is just to unpack or explode contemporary art and insist that we see that in an anthropological, through an anthropological lens as not just one kind of thing, but as a much more fluid and open category than is often presented as. And the second point really follows on with that, because moving from Vanuatu back to the UK, carrying on to work with people in Vanuatu, but also people in New Zealand, in the United States, and particularly working with Indigenous artists, engaging with museum collections, very much as you were talking about, Sokari. I found an article written by Nancy Mithlow in about, I think it's from 2004, really quite helpful, and it's really stuck with me. And the title of the article is Red Man's Burden. And in this article, she's talking about how native or indigenous artists and curators have to bear the responsibility to kind of salvage, in this ironic turn of events for the salvage collections that were made in the 19th century, but salvage the reputation of museums and collections by bringing their own aesthetic practices, curatorial labour, interpretive work into museums to kind of solve the problem of these difficult legacies for ethnographic and other kinds of collections that were made under colonial conditions. And so whilst the period of time that I've been working has seen this huge and really positive opening up of collections to different constituents and stakeholders, to so-called source communities or indigenous artists and curators, Mithlow is really sort of showing us both sides of that and talking about how that can also be burdensome as the weight and responsibility for collaboration, for showing, for assuming or identifying the representational problems is falling on the shoulders of people who have already suffered from those trajectories historically and who are the sort of inheritors of those problems in many ways. And I found that also very helpful in dealing with the responsibilities that I have as a curator of a collection, which is implicated in those histories, and in taking forward the ways in which we negotiate the relationships of artists and other people, stakeholders that come in to work with our collections. And then the third and final point that also has come out of my research practice over the years and my curatorial practice really concerns this question of the time of the ethnographic collection. So I hope I'm trying to speak to some of the questions that we were posed, which is really about what is the relationship of contemporary art, what are the practices that bring contemporary art and ethnographic collections together. But in that dynamic, I think very much the ethnographic collection has become a historical artifact in itself, from which the contemporary art provides a kind of modern day or present day counterpoint. And I'm spending a lot of time at the moment thinking about what is the future of ethnographic collecting. Does it make sense, or is it even possible to continue to make ethnographic collections that extend beyond the collection of objects as art or beyond the collection of contemporary artworks? I think this is a very fraught question for contemporary museums and for collecting institutions. And so something I'm exploring at the moment is whether we can think of something like social media as the modern day ethnographic collection, complete with the corporate extractive sort of mode that's replacing the extractive modes of colonial government, taking everyday cultural production, framing it, appropriating it, extracting value from it in new representational contexts. I'm not convinced by that, actually, but I am convinced that contemporary art is not enough as a kind of category to replace the ethnographic collection as a new register of trying to capture the wide variety and diversity of human experience and cultural production around the world. I think if we can cope with and deal with our kind of complex legacies and problematic histories, we can also think about future of collecting in a more expansive way. And contemporary art and contemporary artists shouldn't have to be the only kind of zone and group of people that carry that representational burden. We need to expand our collecting to think about other kinds of people and other kinds of makers and other kinds of objects. So I think those are my 3 comments, which I hope are opening up some provocations maybe for discussion.
Thank you all so much, and can I just thank you. It's a real privilege for us to have you all here today, to welcome Nick back, to have Sokari here for the first time at the Courtauld, which I feel as much. We should have done this much earlier, but it's absolutely thrilling to have you, Heidi, here, and thank you very much for those sort of posing those questions at the end. Sorry. Speak into this. Posing those questions at the end, which I think do start to bring together some of the issues that as well lie below what was talked about earlier. I was very taken with the sense of the burden, your use of the term burden, and I mean certainly even when I was an anthropological ethnographic curator, I think one felt that. And I don't know whether Nick, you also, as someone embedded in an institution which has these implicit and deep challenges, whether you feel equally, as it were, the weight of responsibility, almost sort of more than institutional responsibility, but ethical responsibility in thinking through, trying to struggle with what these collections now are and are for. I'll come back to it in a minute, but your point about the burden on the artist, so that brings us back to Sokari, almost to try and solve the problem for us, which perhaps has been happening implicitly rather than explicitly explored. I think it's another very powerful question that lies absolutely there with us. But I wanted to ask another question, which happens to speak to my own interests. I'm sort of using you here to answer something I wanted to know about. When you, I think, let me find my notes, you were talking about the Vanuatu National Museum and makers of work that could be called ethnographic, could be called craft, could be called art, and the fact that there is no, as a Western model art world, there are no galleries, no dealers, no materials, no art shops. But the critical thing that I've heard you say is that they know they are marginal. So in that case, they're working outside a conventional Western art mode, but they are aware, therefore you're implying, I thought, that that world exists somewhere. Or did I misunderstand you?
Yeah, I suppose I didn't mean marginal in that sense as in a negative way.
No.
I just think they felt very much outside of the big networks of the global contemporary art world as it circulates through the biennials, whether it's in Dakar or in Venice or in Sydney.
Sure.
Even.
Yeah. No, but it was the question of whether I think I wrote, they know they are marginal. What did you mean by that?
I meant that they don't feel a part of that global contemporary art discourse,
So
but they do call themselves contemporary artists. Okay. But the discussions about what contemporary artists means in that context is not in reference to what we in this room would probably imagine or visualise as being contemporary art.
Okay. Okay. So that was a slight. I apologise. That was a sort of not a sideline at all, but something I particularly wanted an answer to. But can we go back to the question of burden, and perhaps ask Sokari and Nick to speak to that, in a way the challenge that Heidi put down about whether, Sokari, do you feel there is a burden on you as an artist in responding to material which is frequently located in museums, in departments or galleries, which are labelled often ethnographic?
That is a tough question, isn't it? Very tough question. All I can say is that the ethnographic objects that are in museums I see as contemporary. And being a contemporary artist, I'm very happy to have a conversation with these objects once I have an idea of what they are. Because, I've looked in the stores at the British Museum, and you feel as if you ought to libate before you go to look at some things. In fact, I did libate in the Smithsonian, just because you feel as if you ought to appease the gods and things, because it's alive.
Yeah.
I don't really see these objects as dead, really. It's a culture that's within all of us.
That's very interesting point. Nick, do you want?
I was
to respond
absolutely
to that?
intrigued by the comments you made about the problem of the masquerade pieces being out of context, but really specifically because in the Africa galleries at the British Museum, which I think were opened about 18 years ago, now unless I've got this history wrong, I mean your works were put there in the company of those masquerade pieces,
yes.
And were presumably the job they were being asked to do was to suggest that context of performance. And I think, I'm sure the curators had their own version of that problem, and that's also, of course, why they put video in of performance. But I suppose the question I have for you is, are you happy in that gallery? I mean, do you feel that the presence of your work or the presence of the video redresses the lack of context which is otherwise widely apparent in many museum displays?
I always feel a little kind of depressed or annoyed that these places are so stuffed with things, making the situation sort of slightly, not slightly, totally unnatural and out of context, even though the curators have made an awful lot of effort to, add context and give us space with film and stuff like that. But it's just the constraints, I guess, of being in a building and trying to explain the world. It's not an easy thing to do, but I do wish if there was cash, it would be great to kind of display better in these museums, because they always seem to, display things as if they are colonized objects. Yeah. Rather than something that involves us all.
So when you said they're very crowded, I mean, does that mean that, in a sense, the more overtly artistic display that they prefer in some American art museums, where they have African collections where things are sparser and lit more spectacularly, is that better?
Oh, it's better for me.
Right. Well, that's interesting.
It's better for me. I mean, is it the Muslim Gallery at the British Museum at the moment?
Yeah.
Is absolutely overcrowded, and you know, it is describing a huge area of the world, and you just feel as if you need more space to see all the objects, because every object just has so much kind of power and interest, and it's all packed together like that. It's very hard to enjoy it all.
Could I? I mean, I find that absolutely fascinating and totally, you know, I'm feeling with you exactly what my version of what you're feeling. But I wonder whether I could are you suggesting that? No, I'm going to phrase it differently. I apologise. I'm going to phrase it as the question I was asked to ask, and so I'm going to put it in that. But it has its own inherent problems. The question is how do you think the inclusion of contemporary art makes visitors interact differently with the ethnographic objects on display? The problem with the question is it begs the question who the visitors are, and there are many different visitors. But nonetheless. Can you have a go at answering that question? Presumably articulate certain particular types of visitors. I mean, you go into a gallery. You are an artist. You go into a gallery of either Nigerian art or works from other parts of the world or other traditions, and you're responding as yourself, as an individual, and also as an artist. Do you think, other people have different responses to in going into a gallery context with perhaps they're more familiar? So if we took take a category of visitor, do you think it helps the visitor having the contemporary art?
I mean, I think that's such a huge question because there's so many different kinds of contemporary art practice that, and art engages with collections in different kinds of ways, and there are different kinds of ethnographic objects as well. But I suppose all I can say is for the last few years I sent UCL students into the British Museum African collections to talk about the display strategies and actually what your question...
I'm sorry, this has happened before.
It's the wind.
It's obviously our local ghost. It happens, things event, it goes away then. I don't know what causes it, I'm sorry. Carry on. It's the spirit of the masquerade.
Exactly, there's a comment coming. What they all noted was that visitors don't look at the ethnographic objects, they only look at the artwork. So that's just an empirical fact based on a little bit of visitor studies in the Africa galleries. I don't think one can generalise. I think it depends on the artwork and the collections.
I mean, Nick, have you done any observational studies or surveys or discussions with visitors, any categories of visitors, either in Cambridge or in Oceania or in any other activities you've been involved with?
Well, in Cambridge we have someone very brilliant actually who does sustained evaluation and tracking with visitors, so she would be able to answer that question. I can't exactly, but I think the experience is mixed. I mean, we've acquired contemporary art and exhibited contemporary art, I think, for three reasons. I mean, one is actually that it's to do with building relationships, and so if we're working with communities and artists, especially with projects where it might involve acquiring quite a range of work over a period. That opportunity, partly funded by the Art Fund, among other bodies, to engage with a community of artists and build collections is just incredibly rewarding. I mean, obviously it wouldn't make sense if we didn't then go on and exhibit it. Also because I mean, modern art used to be something people couldn't understand. Now contemporary art is a form of popular culture, so it provides a gateway into collections that can otherwise be, perhaps historically challenging, not necessarily readily understandable to some audiences. Also, because of the point I made when I spoke earlier, I mean, we see artists as co-interpreters of the cultures and histories and
stories of encounter that we're trying to work through. So, and I think that was one of the points that Foster was making, is this a kind of quick fix? And I think in a sense it is, but I think it's a kind of, it's a valid strategy to pluralize curatorial perspectives and voices within a museum space.
Should we open the questions? I think we'd like to open the questions out to the audience now. So we're ready to take any that are... Thanks. Sarah, would you like to start?
Yes, I'd like to ask the panel if they're acquainted with and what they think of exhibitions, for example, at the Musée du Quai Morley, which to me are wildly politically incorrect. For example, the one called Cheveux Chéris, which was mixing shrunken heads to do with hair, like fabulous hair was the title, with shrunken heads mixed up with Duchamp's tonsure, mixed up with video footage of women having their head shaved during the Nazi occupation, all presented in the most spectacular way as an extremely expensive and well-marketed exhibition. It seems to be on a different kind of level than this very delicate, what is the delicate mix between contemporary and the classic ethnographic museum. And I wondered if I just think it's so extraordinary that your colleagues can put on things that we wouldn't dream of putting on here in a very spectacular way without the slightest, I was going to say shame or uncomfortableness. I wonder if you have any reactions to that or you participate.
Well,
I can speak.
Heidi is very familiar with the Cave of Wadi, so do you want to answer that first, Nick, and then go to Heidi?
No, I mean, I spend a lot of time in that exhibition. I don't think that exhibition is actually representative of the exhibitions that Quai Morley does in general, and I agree with you with that. In that particular case, I was really uncomfortable and shocked walking around that show, and I couldn't quite understand what was going on, and there were some really odd juxtapositions. But actually, I think as a kind of body of temporary exhibitions, because I think one could also levy quite a lot of criticism at the permanent displays in the Musée Quai Morley, and there has been a lot of critique of that. But as a body of temporary exhibitions, I think a lot of the exhibitions they do are actually really interesting. They're for me as an anthropologist, exhibitions that really do translate key debates that are happening in anthropology into three-dimensional dialogues between objects and texts and in a kind of mise en scène. Not that exhibition, I don't know, I haven't seen every exhibition they've ever done, but I think that's anomalous and it was a weird one, I think, and I completely agree with you. But I'm not sure that it's, I think there's a bigger question, which is actually that there are still sites of representational authority that are not as cognizant or don't present themselves as cognizant of the large body of critique that has emerged to surround these collections. And it's surprising to me that how often that is ignored. But it's equally as surprising when you think about how questions of illicit antiquities trading are ignored in the halls of classical collections, even in the British Museum, even though we know many of those histories are equally as problematic as the histories of ethnographic collections. So it's a broader question for sort of inherently conservative museums in, let's say, the old world, I think. But I think that exhibition might have been anomalous. I don't know if you would agree, Nick.
So I think actually what you said was absolutely right. And something that Stefan Martin, the president of the Quai Morley, said to me, in a meeting at one point, was that a museum should be like a theatre, and I think he sort of meant that if you run a theatre, you might do Macbeth, you might do Beckett, you might do a pantomime for children. I mean, not all the exhibitions have the same agenda or message. And I think that Heidi's right that the temporary programme has been very eclectic, and it's included things like the Kanak exhibition, which Emmanuel Casafaru, who's now a sort of deputy director, did about Kanak culture and history. And I think that particular show is the most extraordinary thing of that kind that's been done by any European museum that I've seen. Actually, in part because I think it basically just sort of obviated the art ethnography distinction in an extraordinarily impressive way. That exhibition, the hair one, I think is in a way wasn't sort of unknowingly wrong. I think it's part of a genealogy that relates to some earlier very provocative things that they did at one of the antecedent museums, projects that Jacques Aynard did in Neuchâtel, which, for example, combined ethnographic works with those sort of pornographic images of Jeff Koons and so on, that, you know, in a sense, were meant to be deliberately challenging. I mean, I personally think that museums of that kind should do exhibitions about themes and aspects of human life, like hair. And I certainly felt it was problematic. And in Cambridge, actually for a long time, the people who work at the front desk used to tell people who asked about shrunken heads, the curators took them away because it was politically incorrect, which wasn't what we wanted people at the front desk to tell visitors. But it is true, actually, that they haven't been exhibited for a long time. So I think there's another, there's a specific context in a way to that exhibition, which I think I agree with you about.
Question over here.
This might be a bit of a naive question, because I must admit I'm not a specialist of ethnography in any way. But if we consider that to some extent, any piece of art and contemporary art reflects and mirrors the social, political, and cultural context of like the artists, for example, how do you actually create a divide between ethnographical objects and art? And you were talking about your students going, sorry, I've got your name, I'm so sorry, but you talked about your students going to the British Museum and telling you that they saw that the visitors were more appealed to the art pieces, but how do they actually differentiate the art from objects and what they are? So yeah.
Well, they're differentiated because the artists are named,
Okay.
and they have a date a recent date of collection. The style, I mean, that goes back into the way in which these categories are produced by museums, styles of display. They're not, you're right, they're not natural categories, they're constructed categories, and one way in which they're constructed are these traditions of displays. It's very obvious in that gallery what is the collection and what is contemporary, and they're marked in different ways. Big project in kind of recurating those collections across many museums is to return to those collections and try to put in more detail to kind of make that more analogous. So that's, Nick, something you did in Oceania, was to add in more known detail about these objects that historically would never have been presented as made by named artists, or would never have been presented as collected on actual named days or dates, and so on and so forth. So I think that's part of the role that museums are playing in defining these categories.
Sokari, you spoke in relation to your own discussion about interacting with works in a museum context. Can you see ways in which that categorization, that division, could be overcome by doing things differently in museums?
I'm not a curator, but I would like things done very differently. Just because, I do think that the lovely British Museum is colonial. It just, it's an extraordinary place. There's an awful lot of information that is in the wrong place. Things like putting Egypt so far away from Africa galleries, for one. I think that's rather odd, because, it's in the same continent, But I like the way that the new Islamic gallery goes from West Africa to Iran, of course, the galleries could be presented differently. They could be presented on cultural lines, trading lines, religious lines, which I think is far more approachable, rather than an object, and they don't even know which way to put it, and the artist is unknown, and then that's it, an object that's been kind of kidnapped.
And I'm very, very aware as someone running an institution of the fact that one often has great ambitions and desires, and there's the hard reality of cost, planning, permissions, governance and whatever in blocking the many years between an aspiration and any sort of achievement. Having also worked in your museum, if time, place, money were no barriers, and you could do what you liked with the... I'm not talking about the British Museum, it's too big a challenge, but Archaeology in Cambridge, given the way you've been engaging with these issues, very deeply for many, many years, do you have a vision of what you could do?
I think a lot of it would be doing more temporary exhibitions that were responsive to people. I mean, it should all be social and interactive, and one of the privileges, of course, is travelling and being able to talk to people in the Pacific or in Benin City or somewhere, and getting a sense of where they're going, and in a way one would like to be able to give space for some of those sort of stories to be told. But I think in a way the most useful answer I can make is that I'm really interested in the sense in which all of these collections are cross-disciplinary, and I'm interested in doing things like I can't talk in detail about this project, but bringing some work from the Pacific together with one of the old master paintings in the Fitzwilliam, because there are certain kinds of thematic connections. I'm interested in doing things with natural history collections, because we think of natural specimens as natural specimens, but they're actually usually artful creations of particular kinds. There was a dodo skeleton that Martin and I used in the Discoveries exhibition, and when I first knew that the Zoology Museum had this, I assumed it was the skeleton of one dodo, but it was actually reconstructed from many different bird bones. There are very often there are things in natural history collections and things in ethnographic collections that were collected by the same people from the same people, so that the sculpture that Lisa Rehana used was given to the founding curator's father, a man named Carl von Hugel, who went to New Zealand in the 1830s, by a man who was also providing him with specimens of birds and all sorts of things, and incidentally also gave him a specimen of a tattoo, that is, putting one on his arm. And so there are all of these kind of interactive stories that connect things that end up being in different museums. And they're in different museums because of categories of scientific knowledge that it's rewarding now to cut across.
It's exciting.
Yeah. Yes.
Do you think you could talk a little bit more about Oceania? Because that seemed, a prime example of blurring of boundaries between, ethnographic objects, and that did seem to be presented as aesthetic objects.
You make your question louder, please, so I can hear it back.
Or maybe Nick can repeat the question.
Well, the question was, could I just say a bit more about Oceania and the question of blurring of boundaries? I mean, that's I think. Well, we presumed from the start, I think, that many of the works we were looking at for inclusion, you know, did have powerful aesthetic qualities and were works of art in an unambiguous sense. And we wouldn't have accepted the idea that we were, in a sense, sort of decontextualizing or redefining things in some Eurocentric terms by representing them in that way. Because in many of the Pacific cultural contexts, if somebody is producing a prow sculpture for a canoe or an ancestral image for a meeting house, they're wanting to produce something that is representative in a certain sense, but also immensely powerful and overwhelming. So they're definitely images and forms that were intended to have aesthetic effect, but I mean possibly in this more in the sense of, you know, the way Edmund Burke talks about the sublime and the impact on you and the way you're overwhelmed by a sublime spectacle or scene, rather than in the way, you know, people otherwise talk about aesthetics. But I mean, there's another kind of story about that exhibition, which was that we were not, because it was dealing with the whole region, it wasn't about engaging in a consultation process with every different community and saying, what story do you want us to tell? But it was, in a sense, drawing on the ideas of Pacific intellectuals, Pacific post-colonial intellectuals of particularly of the 90s, but to some extent also of a sort of earlier moment in the sort of history of decolonisation and new cultural debate going back to the 70s, where various artists, writers, academics were fashioning ideas of a new Oceania. And the curatorial argument, in a sense, was inspired by and aligned with those arguments in various ways.
There's a question behind, but is yours a follow-on of the same question? Okay, I'll come into a second. Okay, yeah.
You allowed various people in the day before the exhibition who made offerings to some of these objects. How did people feel about that?
Well, how we felt about it was that it couldn't have happened.
The question was that one of our people, members of the audience, saw the exhibition before it opened. Is that right? Or in early morning one day perhaps, when the offerings were being made regularly in the exhibition, and then Nick is going to take on the answer to that.
Well, just briefly, I mean, the practices and protocols that have emerged in the Pacific, if, for example, something like this is done in New Zealand, it could not happen without those blessings. And we could only do the exhibition if we listened to people and got a sense of what protocols they felt were important, and we enabled them to take place.
So, Sokari, I mean, that is in a sense beginning to go a little way towards what I felt you were talking about, which is literally recognising both in the real culture from which objects have emerged, and giving them the respect and the space, and understanding their power.
Yes.
Which is both the aesthetic. It can be for those who maybe don't understand them, the aesthetic power, but I think you were talking about power in yet another way, beyond just aesthetic power.
Yes. Religious power.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, these objects that are seen as objects here are ancestors to some people. So, you just have to acknowledge them. Otherwise it's very uncomfortable.
Can I go to the question over there? Yeah.
Just looking at something Heidi said earlier, ask a question, what's the future of ethnographic collections? And I read something a week ago by Albukhary who was the president of ICON. The speech he gave, he said, it's about time we questioned the fundamental basis of the situation and killed, I repeat, killed the Western model of museum. And through this whole conversation, I've just got a sense of, was the ethnographic running to keep up with the contemporary? I'm just wondering if we reframe the question is, what's the future of contemporary art? And whether anyone's got any thoughts about that.
That's another.
I
Did you
think
hear all of that?
yeah, I
Yes,
did. That's a
because-
great question.
Yeah.
I think I like that question because I don't see it quite as the ethnographic running to keep up with the contemporary. I see the contemporary as becoming a new kind of ethnographic collection in those old terms. So when you sent the list of questions, and one of them was what's the fresh look to ethnographic collections, what good work is going on, what examples can you think of? And I was thinking of a visit that I made last year to the Zeitz Museum in Cape Town of Contemporary African Art. It's the first museum. Have you been, Sokari, to this? So it's the first museum in Africa just dedicated to contemporary African art. And like the Saatchi collection, it's based on the collection of a particular family collection, non-black African family collection. And I think that, to me, exemplifies some of these issues, that why I would think that, in fact, the contemporary art you could see some of these trends in global contemporary art mirroring some of the trajectories of ethnographic collections of before. So you have very ahistorical, context-free, highly aestheticized collection of art that doesn't give us any purchase into different regional or local or national differences within the African continent, which there's a tremendous uniformity in the display style and aesthetic, even as there's a great diversity of subject matter, but in which there are certain tropes and representational conventions that are getting kind of really entrenched very normatively. So I actually think it's the other way around. We need to treat contemporary art more as ethnographic as well, and understand, and it needs to be presented perhaps more in that contextualized way. And I think that ahistoricism that often comes through in the kind of, it's not individual artworks, but in the kind of way in which contemporary art is often presented as endlessly of the present moment, actually does a disservice to raising some of the issues that emerge when you then contrast it with the ethnographic collection. So it's interesting.
Well, it's a sort of complementary point, because I think there are a lot of exhibitions which, in a sense, parade the globalization of the contemporary, but and so show artists from many different places, but all the works are mixed media installation or digital. So that, in other words, they're showing works that are already in dialogue with each other, not the kind of work that you talked about from Vanuatu, which actually has its own space and trajectories that are independent of those engagements. But I think the, I mean, I don't know that many biennales, but the one that is sort of distinctive, I think, is the Asia Pacific Triennial in Brisbane, which started out as being Asia Pacific for sort of political and strategic reasons, and the institutions and sponsors never really thought about what it meant to include the Pacific, which was essentially this space where there were not art schools or art institutions, but over a sort of period of more than 20 years has gradually tried to say, well, what are we actually doing by engaging with artists from that area, and what that has involved as being, representing all of these grassroots women's textile genres and, the modern versions of CPIC house facades and these sorts of things. So it's actually I think, moved in a rather extraordinary way towards representing what is the genuine diversity of contemporary art.
This is a deliberately provocative and trite point, but I think it's an important one. And it addresses your point, Heidi, about contemporary art perhaps should be presented in a more ethnographic way, to crudely summarise what you said. And Nick, your point about addressing objects, blurring boundaries between scientifically imposed categorisation of material culture. And I just want to advance a suggestion that contemporary art might be a separate category. And I think my question is addressed to Sokari, because I'd like to hear your view on it. I work with a lot of senior living artists. And painters and sculptors I work with, some of them would very, very proudly categorise their work as art for the reason it has no practical purpose. And they, I mean, it obviously has a market purpose and it makes them a living, but they would proudly say, these painters and sculptors, the reason what I do is art is because it has no purpose other than the aesthetic. And in a way that's quite different to what you've been saying. I'm just interested, Sokari, does your work have purpose beyond the aesthetic? Or would you want it to?
Gosh. I've had, I don't know what to say. I hope it's more than not having any purpose at all. Just because, I don't know, because of my beliefs, I think. My beliefs have had quite I don't know, a formative way of encouraging my work, because I don't know, the Brit Pack or Damien Hirst and co were quite prepared to sort of be God and put fish in tanks and stuff, whilst I was terrified to give features to my work, because Kalabari people believe that if you put faces on figures, they'll come alive and trot around and cause havoc. So I think quite a lot of my beliefs had to be worked through in my career to get to the place that I'm at the moment, which is less afraid of my beliefs. So yes, I think the thing of making work has been, it's almost like a therapy session all my life, but that's the way I see it. It's not just about making something to sell. It's not a box to sell.
Sarah?
Yeah, I feel compelled to say in this context that it is, after all, a Cambridge anthropologist, Nicholas Story-Chaikov, who promotes what he calls ethnographic conceptualism, and I work very closely with him, and we have sessions on ethnographic conceptualism in my MA course on global conceptualism. So, I mean, this proximity and the kind of work my students are doing, which are precisely looking at artists. I mean, one is an artist in Germany who is a comparison between artists in Germany looking at net, anonymous work on the net, and somebody looking at, I think it's called Craig something or other. It's where people sell things.
Craigslist.
She puts together all the photos on Craigslist where they're dogs, where people are trying to sell their boat or their bicycle, and it's got dogs in it. I mean, there is this enormous wave of specifically very well informed ethnographical practice in contemporary art and theorists of ethnographic conceptualism and so forth, which are floating around and a part of our own practice as teachers. So I just, having thought I wouldn't say that, I just thought I'd better just get it out there and say that that's what we're doing. And so we're all very closely connected.
It sounds actually more like social anthropology than ethnographic.
Well, I mean, Soren Chaikov calls it ethnographic conceptualism. And I love the term. I think it's very sexy, very...
I think at this point, I mean, I just want to thank all three of you for both your wonderful presentations, but also your the conversation we've had, and we'll pass back to the conveners of the evening just to say a few final words before we go and I think carry on the conversation over a drink.
Well, thank you so much to all of our speakers and to our moderator. I think a big round of applause is deserved. It seems like many points were raised tonight, also a lot of critical points which we can all take away in our practice as curators, as museum visitors, as anthropologists, I think in our area of what we do. And I would also like to thank Martin Caiger-Smith for helping to organize this event. As has been mentioned, we're doing a second debate at the beginning of June, so keep your eyes and ears open for that. We have a drinks reception set up on the second floor in the Research Forum seminar room, which you can get to by taking the lift one stairs up or take the stairs at the end of the corridor. So thank you all so much for coming tonight. Thank you for all these engaging questions, and I hope to see you upstairs.
What time is it?